perhaps Facebook is the world's largest cemetery. This short, happy life that they've enjoyed uniquely in the United States and how they're designed might be on the way out. We might be on the verge of the untimely death of modern cemeteries as we know it. And today we're going to investigate why that is and how they came to be the way they are. These hidden stories, surprising anecdotes and innovations that have occurred in burial practices in the United States, and specifically and more importantly, what they say about us and how they reflect who we are. So we're going to start actually in Tombstone, Arizona, circa the 1880s. In the Old West at this time, there were cemeteries that were called boot hills. And they were essentially named that or nicknamed that because people died with their boots on, sudden deaths and shootouts and through other violent encounters or perhaps untimely accidents that occurred. And I'd like to tell you the story specifically about one person named Lester Moore, who lived in Tombstone, Arizona in the 1870s, 1880s. He was a Western Union clerk, and he was working one day when a scoundrel walked in and tried to rob the Western Union house that he was working in. And Les gave up the money, and the bad guy plugged him with 4 shots, bam, 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 bam. And Lester Moore, as he's falling to the ground, pulls out his gun and shoots the scoundrel one time, and the scoundrel dies at this graveyard where death is so familiar to people. They wrote a lot of kind of humorous epitaphs to the people who passed away. And in this case, they paid proper tribute to Les Moore. Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a 44, no less, no more. The cemeteries of the late 1800s were quite different from the cemeteries in what is now the United States from the 1700s or 1600s, as well as the cemeteries that we see today. And we're going to spend some time today tracking the course of American cemeteries and how they reflect the culture, history, religion, art, and really the stories of America as they go. And what happens if we lose these places? For instance, here's a shot of cemeteries from the 1600s in Massachusetts, the Gothic look, the creepy winged skulls on the top of the tombstones. This was a time in Massachusetts when the Puritans really thought that the usefulness of the human body ended from the moment of death when the soul was departed from the body. And there wasn't much need for graves, memorialization, and accepting as kind of a reminder of a reminder of death itself and the dangers in some respects of eternal damnation. And then in the really into the early 1800s, things changed quite a bit. There was this movement to break away cemeteries from the churchyards, which they had been a part of for time immemorial. You think about cemeteries that are part of houses of worship, and that really began a couple thousand years ago and really didn't change until the early 1800s with the cemetery of Père Lachaise in Paris. And shortly afterwards, it also kind of manifested itself in a couple of places in the United States. It started with Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then it grew these untethered cemeteries where people could be memorialized forever, and the uniquely American prospect of everyone getting a trophy in death or everyone getting a grave marker. And Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, was established in 1838, and it really opened up the idea of landscape architecture and art, and that would appear in cemeteries in a way that had never been seen before. And then we get to today. And today, if we think of cemeteries as being the essence of who we are, encapsulated in one spot, then perhaps Facebook is the world's largest cemetery. So I'd like to go back a little bit to the earliest grave markers, the earliest memorialization of human remains. We like to think of burial as being something that is uniquely human, but it actually is done by ants and elephants, and in some cases even dogs have been known to bury their dead. But what separates humans is the symbolic act of memorialization after death. And we can see grave markers, or the earliest discovered grave markers that we have found date back to 13,000 years in Israel. And this cave where these original drawings where people were above where people were deliberately buried was also the place where the very first alcohol was fermented that we know of, which ties the tradition of alcohol with memorialization and funerals that I know that my family has carried on to this day. The earliest known memorialized remains in Europe go back 33,000 years to a cave in Wales. And in North America, the oldest memorialized remains are those of an infant who basically it is traced back to about 12,700 years ago in Montana. The remains were found by some construction workers, and basically they are a set of remains that were covered intentionally in the iron-rich powder of ochre and surrounded by tools and weapons that it's believed that the infant could take to the afterlife. The traditions of indigenous peoples within the United States are as rich and varied as the large populations of indigenous people throughout North America. One tradition that spanned the continent in many places was the scaffold burial. This you can see right here is a Dakota people's scaffold burial, where basically the body of someone, usually someone very important, was placed up in the air for a year or two, and the body was allowed to be exposed to the elements and then also to birds, so that the body could fully go back to nature. And then once that occurred, the bones were buried. But why a hole in the ground? Well, I guess there are a number of reasons. If you talk to anthropologists, they'll tell you that just about every culture has some kind of a history or tradition of burial. For ancient Western cultures, oftentimes the idea of burying in the ground was one that was justified by putting the body closer to the underworld. But there are also practical reasons for that as well. Cremation takes a lot of wood. It's not something you can necessarily do in abundance all the time in every geographic location where wood might be scarce or difficult to harvest. Down below, you see the image of the funeral of Patroclus, and above, it's not like everyone in the Viking world could have their bodies burnt ceremonially in a Viking ship being pushed off to sea. So the act of burial itself is just easier in some regards, and it also protects the body from animals or grave robbing if you dig deep enough and that sort of thing. I had mentioned before about the churchyard burial grounds, and that was largely the tradition for centuries. People would be buried in the geographic areas that were attached to houses of worship. And in many cases, people's graves were never marked. If you think about that Hamlet scene when in Shakespeare's Hamlet, when Hamlet jumps into a grave that's being dug and he sees the bones of the fool, Yorick, and he says, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio." They were removing the bones in that case in order to put, the gravediggers were, in order to put other bodies into those spots. And that's still a tradition that occurs today in many places, including in Europe, where the bodies are, where the bones are placed in ossuaries or in charnel houses and that sort of thing. The idea of the grave being a forever or eternal resting place is one that is largely and almost uniquely American in many respects. Not that it was that way originally. We can see here the Trinity Churchyard burial ground, one of the oldest urban burial grounds in America. And at one time in the 1800s, it had over 100,000 bodies buried within it.